So welcome here. I'm Janine Birchie Johnson, and been part of Central District most of my life, except 6 years when I was pastoring in Western District Conference. And I just recently graduated with a Doctor of Ministry degree from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, where I've been working for 31 years as campus pastor. And my dissertation was on healing after the shame of difficult ministry endings. And the little byline is not due to misconduct. So I'm sharing some of what I learned in my research and also encouraging us to think about how shame functions in our congregations and how we can help people heal from it. So I hope my voice lasts through this. I've been fighting a cold and I feel fine, but my voice has not reappeared yet. So after I graduated from AMBS in 1989 with my MDiv, I went to Wichita, Kansas for 6 years and pastored at Lorain Avenue Mennonite Church. And then I was invited to come back to AMBS. And then in addition to my campus ministry role, I also am an admissions counselor, the alumni director, and I teach a class every year, one credit class. So just recently I taught Trees of Life, and next year I'll teach Water of Life, which are classes that get to integrate my love of environment with biblical and spiritual liturgical aspects of water and trees. So I'm going to be focusing on a little broader aspects of shame in this seminar than just what I focused on in my dissertation. But if you're interested in reading my dissertation, I'm very glad to send you a copy of that so you can read it. I think now the official version of it has been finished. They had to check for all the, I didn't know there was a difference between hyphens and N dashes and M dashes. And yeah, so all those things have now been figured out, and I learned a lot through it. So in my studies of shame, I learned that there's no single definition. Each researcher, and there's been a lot of research, especially on dispositional shame, each researcher has had different definitions of it. And the word cloud that I created, you can see some of the words that appeared the most often. Unfortunately, the words that appeared less often are completely invisible, but that's okay. You get the main ones here. So the larger the word, the more often it appeared in a definition. And what do you notice as you look at those words? What stands out to you in that word cloud?
A lot of worrying about how other people view you.
Yeah.
A lot of sinking feelings.
Wow.
Heavy.
Yes. Heaviness, sinking.
A lot of negative, yes.
Yeah.
Comparison to others, or comparison to what we think the standards are.
Yes. Yeah. That you notice? Well, the definition of shame that I composed for my study was an emotional response to rejection, failure, or loss of standing in the eyes of others or oneself, which threatens a person's self-identity and connections to others. So shame is an emotion. It is negative for most people. There are some people who say there is a role for shame. But shame is one of the self-conscious emotions, which means that it involves how we see ourselves and how we imagine or believe that other people see us. And so shame often impacts us even if those other people don't really think that about us. All that matters is that we think they think something about us. So that's what we mean when we say it's a self-conscious emotion. Two core aspects of shame are a sense of exposure. So that sense of being seen, and often that's unwanted attention, and a sense of judgment, believing that others are negatively evaluating us. And sometimes it's judging ourselves as well. A common response to shame is a desire to hide or conceal ourselves or our limitations. That is one thing that these different definitions will often talk about. And in North American culture, there is shame about shame. We don't want to talk about it. And Brene Brown's work has really emphasized how important it is that we do talk about it. Like guilt, shame is also a moral emotion with the potential to shape our behavior. So we might feel shame in response to actual behaviors or anticipated behaviors that violate our own values or the standards, the expectations of our community. And so while the difference between guilt and shame is guilt is usually felt in response to a behavior. I did something bad. And shame is usually emphasizes who we are. I did something bad. So they can go together. They often do go together. Sometimes we talk about shame when we mean guilt. Sometimes people talk about guilt when they mean shame. But the general division that most researchers have focused on for the last 40 years or so is that guilt focuses on behavior and shame focuses on the person. And some of the newer research is questioning that and saying it's not so easy to divide those, but that's kind of where the standard definitions go. Sources of shame. Each person has their own areas of vulnerability to shame, and part of that has to do with our personality. Part of it's due to our past experiences. But some of the common sources of shame are a transgression, doing something that we believe is wrong, or being the kind of person that we don't want to be, or deviating from social norms and being judged for that. So that's one common one. Another source of shame is dissonance between our public persona and our private life. So if we believe that we act as if we're a good parent when we're out public, but at home we don't live that out the way we wish we would, then we may judge ourselves for that discrepancy. Personal failure or defeat, and this is where my dissertation focused, is the perceived failure of a ministry situation, but this is a common source of shame in our culture especially. That can include the loss of vocation or not being able to advance in one's career. So somebody who thinks they're going to climb the ladder, employment ladder, and doesn't get the promotion can feel shame about that. Rejection or shunning from others, especially a significant person. And this is where if rejection or disapproval from a significant person happens often in one's childhood, that often will create what researchers call dispositional shame or chronic shame. And that's that kind of ongoing sense that I am not enough, I am not good. And that's the kind of shame that almost all of the research has been done on, is chronic dispositional shame. So Brene Brown's work and many, many others have focused there. And I chose to focus on a part of shame that's hardly ever studied, and that is what I call situational shame, shame that comes from a specific experience. And in my case, what I was studying was the shame of having a ministry end in a difficult way. Another source of shame that's common is shaming or humiliation from others or by others. And that can be intentional, but it can also be unconscious. And this includes, I would say, some forms of church discipline that were used in the past and sometimes in some churches today. In our culture, as much as we don't want to talk about shame, the rise of shaming is really noticeable. Social media has made it very easy to shame other people without having to face them. And so many of the things I was reading were about how we confront that shaming mentality that many in our culture have. Another source of shame can be trauma, especially if no one stands up for you, believes you, or supports you. So a woman who is raped, if she has adequate support right away and people say, I believe what happened, I believe your story, and it's not your fault, and we want to support you, might end up feeling less shame than a woman who is raped and people are like, well, what were you wearing? You know, like that is a shaming response in a sense, even though it wasn't a certain, I mean, they might have intended it. But trauma can lead to shame if people are not adequately supported. Then there's structural shame, such as sexism, heterosexism, racism, and stereotypes, where whole groups of people are shamed for who they are, some characteristic of them, and we can name many of those. Powerlessness can lead to shame. And then there's the whole cluster of appearance, body image, aging, sexuality, social media comparisons and attacks. A sense of inadequacy or not being good enough is one definition of shame. But if that's what people are feeling, just I can't measure up, then shame may result from that. Conflict can sometimes lead to shame. So can negative judgments from self and others. And then one of the things that really applied to what I was studying was the sense that you're not following God's call for your life. So if someone feels like they've been called into ministry and then all of a sudden there's an end to that can make people feel like I'm not living up to what God has called me to be. So Brene Brown's research found 12 areas in which North American women struggle the most with feelings of shame: appearance and body image, motherhood, family, parenting, money and work, mental and physical health, sex, aging, religion, being stereotyped and labeled, speaking out, women having a voice, and surviving trauma. And then later she went back and did some research on men. And for North American men, shame is most often triggered by failure, powerlessness, and perception of weakness. So notice those are very different lists of what can be a source of shame. Now, in other cultures than North America, the sources of shame can be very different. And I did a little bit of study on that. But shame is just dealt with very differently in an honor shame culture than in a guilt innocence culture. So what shames me may not shame you, and vice versa. So take a couple of minutes and think about some of the sources of shame in your own life, if you have ever experienced that, or maybe situations that have caused you shame. And you're not going to share this is just for yourself, but just think about what have been some things that have triggered shame in your own life. If you want to jot those down, that's fine, but you're not going to share it. All right, do you have any questions about what I've shared so far? So I'm going to ask you to enter a conversation together here. How do you think shame is impacting individuals in our congregations? What are some of the things you've noticed? It doesn't have to be your own experience, but what do you notice in your congregation? What are some sources of shame? Or the impact of it? Yeah.
The congregation, like, so, take people with less education or raised or So class differences, source of shame, personally. That impacts the congregational life.
Sure.
I think women, for many years, in the church, were not, many of our people were not allowed to serve in different leadership positions, and so there's shame there.
At our church, everything is done by volunteers, and so sometimes people are called to do things that they don't feel they're very good at. So that they can actually help back from, say, giving a decent sermon because they're so ashamed of themselves that they don't think they can do
I was
it.
thinking about that too, in terms of like imposter syndrome.
Mhm. Great observations.
Our fellowship used to do a lot of, doing things in our homes. But there are now people in the fellowship who don't feel very comfortable about inviting people into their homes. A lot of comparisons.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I love entertaining people, but I'm not a good cook. It's like, yeah. But other people are like, well, my home is not as nice as other people's homes, and yeah.
Actually paired up with somebody.
Yeah.
To do the cooking while she
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
Come over to my house for ice cream.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. All right. What impacts on your congregation? Some of you have hinted at this already, but is shame acknowledged within your congregations at all? Or does it kind of just lurk there in those relationships? That aren't equal, or the feelings that we're not good enough, or
There can be shame in churches around, substance abuse and mental illness, and our
Yeah.
church has tried really hard to normalize
Yeah.
that. And we, in our monthly celebrations, we celebrate, people's anniversaries of their sobriety and things like that to try to take away that shame, but I think there's probably some of that still residual in people.
And people like myself can stand up and say, I'm struggling with depression right now. Could you please pray for me? And because mental illness isn't something to be ashamed of.
Like any other broken bone or whatever else.
But we have sharing joys and concerns, prayer. It's almost always prayers about physical things. It's very rarely people talk about struggling with emotional stuff.
We don't acknowledge people's struggle with their shame when they're trying to perform a duty because as if it would draw more attention to it.
Yeah.
You know, if a person is like stuttering or if they can't find their way through their script or whatever, it's like we all kind of pretend that it's not happening. And, and I think maybe that's the humane way to do it, but it's like the elephant in the room kind of thing.
So I have a young lady, who's my worship leader, and she got kicked out of a seminary in Michigan and met with me a few years ago. And I've been trying to get her into a leadership position more. And she has shame because she's part of the LGBT community, and her and her wife both got kicked out. They're 25 now, they're 21. So there's a lot of shame, but I'm trying to let her know, you have gifts and I see the gifts, and trying to acknowledge that it's hard to move the needle from. She's like, well, I can sing, but I don't have to talk and I don't sing. I told her, you still have a voice, a prophetic voice. I know she does. So I'm trying to help her work through that. A guest speaker outside of the church coming in to talk about creating safe places. And then we're trying to create a curriculum to address church hurt and hurt in the Christian community. Because I think if we had something that we told them, wow, to address people that hurt, they wouldn't get stuck in shame.
Yeah.
We can name it and move forward.
That's great. And there have been a lot of things written about how churches contribute to shame. So unfortunately, this is something that many of us are dealing with, folks who come from places where that's what their experience of church was a shaming culture. So, yeah. Okay, so we are focusing today on courage to confront shame. And so I want to switch into shame resilience strategies. And we'll start with Brene Brown's work. But before I do that, I just want to say that if you have yourself or people that you know that are struggling with chronic dispositional shame, that they've had it for a long, long time, healing can be a very long and hard process. And most of the research would say that that requires the help of a qualified mental health counselor to do that work. And there are some really good books that point at some of those strategies, but it's not an easy thing to undo shame that has lasted an entire life. So just so you know, if you're working with someone or you yourself are facing that, probably getting counseling is the best approach. I'm gonna name some things we can help do, but these probably won't be enough for really chronic dispositional shame. So Brene Brown's work about 20 years ago is pretty well known, I think, for many people. Brown describes shame resilience as being able to recognize when you are feeling shame and being able to move through it constructively. Shame resilience, according to her, is a combination of these things. One, recognizing one's personal areas of vulnerability to shame so that a person can reach out when they are feeling violations or vulnerability. Two, having critical awareness about how social and cultural expectations shape one's shame. And that can help people feel that they're not alone, they're not personally flawed. And I think one of the things that was so important about Brown's work was helping women see that so much of the shame we carry as women is culturally conditioned because we're expected to be a certain kind of person and we can't quite do what the culture expects. So being able to feel like this isn't just about me, this is something that's bigger. Three, developing mutually empathic relationships. And that means giving and receiving non-judgmental support through sharing of experiences. And that helps to counter the isolation of shame. One of the definitions of shame is that it isolates us. It makes us want to hide. And so the more isolated we are, the more we just wallow in shame. And to be able to share our experiences, our feelings of shame with others and not be judged for it is really important. Or it's very similar to this, being able to understand and, quote, speak shame. That means accurately expressing the pain of shame experiences and asking for needed support. 5, she names courage, connection, and compassion, 3 C words. And 6, Brown also noted that spiritual connection, a relationship with God, is essential to shame resilience for many people. Not all, but many people that she researched named their spiritual resources as important. Another researcher I studied was Jessica Van Fleet, who focused on shame that comes from specific situations rather than chronic shame. And so Van Fleet was actually the closest study to what I was doing and the person I kind of worked with the most closely. She describes recovery from shame events as including 5 movements of rebuilding the self. The first movement is connecting, and that's a move out of isolation. Finding allies that can come to your side, provide unconditional acceptance. So you'll hear a lot of common themes here. Talking about the shame event with an understanding and accepting listener, and connecting with God through prayer, journaling, meditation, or spending time in nature. So you've already heard some of the same themes in Brown and Van Fleet. But Brown is focused more on chronic shame, while Van Fleet is focused on shame experiences. Second, refocusing includes countering those negative judgments by building positive self-concept and ways of thinking. So this can include working on self-improvement, distancing yourself from the negativity, those kinds of things. 3, accepting. That includes realizing that one cannot change the past, addressing the shame event rather than avoiding it, taking responsibility for your own feelings and responses, and expressing your emotions through crying, talking, creative outlets, all of that. Fourth was understanding, and that means making sense of the shame experiencing and reframing it to find meaning, learning, and growth. And obviously that's going to come at a later stage usually than the expression of the feelings. And then fifth is resisting. That's the way you protect yourself from future shame experiences, such as setting boundaries, challenging beliefs and actions of others that are harmful, insisting that others take accountability or responsibility for their harmful behaviors. So these two researchers really helped kind of set the stage for my own research. I interviewed 5 pastors who had had a difficult experience of a ministry ending, and then focused not on what happened to them in that ending, but on how they healed from it. And the factors that they shared in common were 6 things. First of all was distancing, having time, space, and boundaries. All of us understand the role of time in healing. I mean, that's not a surprise. But the boundaries were especially significant for pastors, like not entering into conversations with people who had hurt them, making physical space from the congregation where they had been hurt. Second is spiritual grounding. Faith practices such as prayer, reading scripture, and other religious material, pilgrimages, connecting with a new faith community. Those were the things my interviewees mentioned. And some people noted that this was kind of surprising, that if you've been wounded by the church, that you would turn to faith practices. But I think these were spiritual practices that were deeper than just the expressions that you find in the local congregation. So people were digging deep into what grounded them. Third was processing and releasing pain, very similar to what Brene Brown and Jessica Van Fleet said. Talking with accepting and non-judgmental listeners, but also some of my folks found journaling really important, especially the introverts. Reading, praying laments, and somatic activities. So exercise was very important to just work out, release all of the emotion. One of the key insights that I found is number 4, affirmation of their ministry gifts and identity by others was really, really important for their healing. So one of the pastors who had been told they were no longer acceptable because of their viewpoints, was invited to preach at the local Lutheran church. And after, got lots of affirmation for that, but after a little bit, they said, can you just celebrate the Eucharist with us too? We don't get to celebrate it except when a qualified person comes in. And if you'll just do that, we love you. We don't care what that other church thought about you. And as I was interviewing this person, this pastor said, that was probably the most significant aspect of their healing, was having someone say, we want you to lead us in this pastoral way. And this was common across my interviews, was having someone who said, you still have gifts for ministry. I believe in that, and giving them opportunities to use those gifts. That took a lot of different forms, but it was really significant. Fifth, understanding the shame event, which for my folks was making sense of what was internal, what was mine, what was my contribution, because when you feel shame, your initial impulse is to think it's all mine. And then what belonged to other people? What did they contribute to what happened? And third was understanding the system, the congregation or the denomination. What in the system made this ending go poorly? And then 6 was transformation, and this had a number of different aspects. Separating from the shame means I am no longer just the shame. Like I can see myself as distinct from it. Developing compassion towards self and others, observing one's personal healing and growth, renewing pastoral identity, and moving toward forgiveness. And only one of my 5 people had gotten to the place where they felt like there was reconciliation with the congregation. But each of them was able to say things like, I decided I wasn't going to be bitter. I have been able to forgive some folks, or there's been partial forgiveness, that all of those things. And then beyond the work of Brene Brown and Jessica Van Fleet and my own research, some other shame resilience strategies that I've listed there. And there's some overlap here for sure. Not hiding, because shame thrives in secrecy. Being vulnerable within healthy relationships. And that's hard sometimes. If you feel shame, you can't always evaluate, well, what's a healthy relationship and what's going to shame you more. Remembering the experiences that caused you shame and imagining yourself giving the shame back to the person who caused it. This is a really helpful technique for people who were shamed as children and don't have access to that person anymore. So doing imagining work and saying, here, Father, you gave me this shame, I'm giving it back to you. Resourcing, supporting yourself with memories and activities that create a sense of calm and competence. And that can include things like breathing, grounding exercises, going to soothing places, petting an animal. Being curious about your feelings without becoming lost in them. Self-affirmation, self-nurturance, and self-forgiveness are huge. And those kind of go along with many of the other things we've talked about. Some researchers talked about embracing your imperfections and like not being ashamed of them. This is who I am. I'm not perfect. And owning your own faults. Having someone with greater honor restore your dignity, remove your shame, or defend you. This is extremely important in an honor shame culture. In an honor shame culture, the way shame is removed is for someone to, with greater honor, to pull you up, to remove your shame, to pronounce that you are no longer being shamed. All of those things. And that had some real resonance in the work I was doing when I looked at like the role of the conference minister. I think many of my pastors that I interviewed said their conference minister was a really key person in helping them heal. And part of that, I think, is the conference minister represents an authority that's greater. So even though we're not an honor shame culture in the global sense, I think the Mennonite world is an honor shame culture with like a subculture. So anyway, and then spiritual tools such as Ignatian meditations, lament, and contemplation. And many people writing from a Christian perspective said looking to God for identity rather than to other people's judgments. I need to move on. I wanted to create a spot, but I think we need to stop very soon to give a break between the sessions. So I want to talk about shame in the Bible, just because this was one of the most fun parts of my dissertation, was to look at how the Bible was written within an honor shame culture, very different than our own. And shame is mentioned more in the Bible than guilt is. So over and over in the Bible, we see God working to lift the shame of humanity. And 2 texts that focus on that. The first one is Luke 15, 11 to 32. We know this parable. We know the story of the prodigal son. But how is shame connected to the behavior of the younger son? What are some of the things the younger son did that were shameful? Yes, shout them out.
It's sorted with pigs.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, squandered his inheritance.
Even eight pigs.
I mean, left his family, that
Yeah.
was probably shameful.
Very, very, very.
Lived an indulgent life.
Yeah. This is the living.
That's.
You can just imagine. Yeah. So it's really easy. And many times we read this parable focused on the shame of the younger son. That has been the dominant interpretation I have heard. More recently, I've heard people talk about the shame of the older son. What would you identify there?
Not feeling as loved by his father.
Mhm. Yeah.
Not being given credit for his work and dedication,
Yeah.
and that he stayed at home.
Yeah, faithfulness.
Seems like there'd also be some shame in not seeing everybody else celebrate their return and you're not, and you don't feel like that. And that, I could see
Yeah.
some shame in being the person who can't be happy.
Yeah.
For the brother's return.
Yeah,
Well, I think it's some of those systems, if your family, like if someone in your family did something shameful, then the whole family
yeah,
owns the shame.
yeah.
There's something kind of pinned about him too. It makes
Okay, yeah,
it's just, this is probably
Yeah.
a rush, but
yeah.
just wondering about that. Why is he?
Okay, so now, how is shame connected to the behavior of the father?
Boy, has his younger son disrespected him, asked for an inheritance before he's dead.
Yeah. And the father gave it to him.
Yeah.
That would be unheard of.
And then things didn't work out.
Right?
So the community might have thought, well, we told you so, or we thought it would.
Yeah.
And here's this old man running.
Yes, the man is running and embraces this guy that smells like pig slop and celebrates him and tells the whole community. So now that I understand how the Bible is written in an honor shame culture, it has given me a totally different understanding of this parable. This is a parable about how God lowers God's self to remove the shame of the sons. God takes on that shame in order to restore the relationships. The father in the parable is acting just as shamefully. We don't see that because we think, oh, isn't that lovely? The father's forgiving and the father, excuse me. But in that culture, what the father did was extremely shameful.
The son was unclean when he came back and
Yes.
working with pigs.
Yes.
In multiple senses of the word.
Yes.
Yes.
So then I link that to the text of Philippians 2:5-11, which says that Jesus, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. The most shameful kind of death. And if you want to read more about that, Jerome Neary has 2 books on shame in Matthew and shame in John that are just fantastic. And he goes through the whole crucifixion narrative and points out all of the shame points that were there, from the public humiliation, the flogging, the sign over Jesus' head, all of that. This was an incredibly shameful death, and yet Christians flipped it on their head and said that this is what redeems us. And when you understand how radical that is, you read some of Paul and other epistles differently, because they're trying to argue how profoundly upside down this is in the culture. So for me, God raising Jesus from death, giving him the most highly exalted position and title, so that all people will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory, which also means honor, and honor shame culture of God. So in exalting Jesus, honor is also restored to humanity, so that humanity can bring glory to God. So that is the little biblical fun stuff I got to do as I was working on the how we heal from shame, is to keep thinking about how the Bible shows God working to restore us from shame by coming to our experience in Jesus and joining us, and including a much more shameful death than any of us will ever experience probably, and in restoring us to honor. So I think we're out of time, but if you want to stay around, I'm sorry I didn't, well, we got started a little late too. But if you want to make some comments, I'm glad to stay here until the next person comes in. If you need to run to the other building, you're released to do that. But I'd be curious to hear from you, what stands out for you in this conversation, so.
I think chronic shame, somebody that's been shamed for decisions they made or, you know, who they are. It can be difficult as an adult to make decisions. I'm reflecting my own experience. It can be difficult to have confidence in one's own decisions. And also then what I've been aware of recently is from this idea of connection, or this anxious connection, because I'm afraid of the other person's opinion. You know, people that are shamed or I think have a harder time of feeling secure in connection. And that's more the chronic shame than the event shame.
And the two impact each other, obviously. So if people have experienced a lot of chronic shame, shame experiences are going to trigger a lot of the memories and a lot of the past experiences as well. So I want to say there is hope for us to address shame in the church. And I hope that this helps you think about ways that you can open up these conversations in your own groups and talk to others about, especially the legacy of shame that comes from the church. I was just amazed. I led a Bible study last year at 8th Street, and the number of people who told stories about how people had been shamed in churches in the past in the name of church discipline. It's really quite sad. So,
Do you have any books you recommend between like shame and the church or anything like that?
there would be several. Is my email on that paper anywhere? JB Johnson.
At the top.
Okay, yeah, email me and I'll send you a list of some really helpful books.
We've been talking about neurodiversity and the
Yeah.
vision of people who like have ADHD and aren't necessarily following like I can see shame involved there in terms of like, the white supremacy culture norms of how we act and how we make decisions and how we show up on time to meetings and how we, all of these things, right?
Yeah,
The shame that can bring to, so it's, that was what's going through my head.
That's really helpful.
We're thinking about that.
and sometimes people don't even catch on, right?
Yeah.
It depends what their awareness is, yeah. Yeah. All right, well, thank you all. Or I'll stick around here. I'm gonna stay for the next 7 or in here anyway. So if you want to talk to me, I'm glad to talk.